ॐ असतो मा सद्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मामृतं गमय ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः Om, lead me from the unreal to the real, lead me from darkness to light, lead me from death to deathlessness. Om, peace, peace, peace. Namaskar, Vivekananda's scientific mind. Let's see, it'll be interesting. Basically, we will listen to Vivekananda's own words. In fact, very often, his words cannot be replaced by any other. After listening to those words, we will reflect on them. First of all, we will focus on science, in particular on two basic features of science. Feature number one, that it is theory plus practice also. It's not enough that I learn physics and go on lecturing. I should have the capacity to apply the theory. So, applied science it is. Feature number two, how is scientific knowledge gained the way conventional science gains knowledge? Well, the procedure is somewhat like this in three stages: experimentation, followed by observation, followed by inference or conclusion. Clearly, that is how it is. Now, this procedure was adopted by Galileo Galilei, the father of modern science, and promoted by him also. But let us remember something else here. It is not as if it is only in conventional science that experiment, observation, inference is followed. It is followed in acquiring any kind of knowledge. Number two, practice and application applies to conventional science but also equally to religion. There are the scriptures of religion, the theory, and there is the practice also, the sadhana, as it was known to be in ancient India. How do we know that Vivekananda might have had a scientific mind, and that too early on in his life? Well, let us take two illustrations. Number one, it's about the application of knowledge, theory. When Narendranath, as he was known by his pre-monastic name, when he was a child, say 10, 11 years old, he was intrigued by two things. One, gaslit street lamps lit by gas brought in through pipes. Number two, aerated water, the so-called soda water, and the sparkling soft drinks. So the scientific mind of Vivekananda, of child Vivekananda, was intrigued. So what does he do? First, he learns the theory of what? Of how gas is produced and of how water is aerated. Well, that is the theory part. What about the application? Because without that, what kind of a scientist are you? Well, unbelievably, Narendra at that young age actually built a tiny machine that produced gas and another tiny machine that aerated water. So, theory plus practice, a complete scientist even at age 10, 11. When he grew to become 20, 21 years old, he kept on hearing that Ramakrishna Paramahansa, his future guru, could not bear the touch of coins because he shunned money. Narendranath's reasoning mind, inquiring mind, couldn't accept it right away because he had not heard anything of that kind from anyone else before, not read about such a thing. Could it really be so? But what should the scientist in Narendra do? Well, he can follow Galileo Galilei. So he starts off with experimentation. One morning, when Ramakrishna Paramahansa's room is empty. He enters the room and keeps a coin under Ramakrishna's mattress and then quietly goes and sits in a corner, awaiting observation, the second stage. Ramakrishna Paramahansa returns, sits on the mattress and springs up in pain, as if stung by a scorpion. That's the observation. Inference is clearly, yes, indeed, Ramakrishna Paramahansa cannot stand the touch of coins, not even the close proximity of it. The scientist Vivekananda tested his future guru, and his future guru approved of it. He said, always test. Now it is 1886 and Ramakrishna Paramahansa is lying on his deathbed, suffering from throat cancer, as we know it to have been today. Maybe allopath doctors also knew it. But doctors, allopaths and naturopaths were prescribing this medicine, this diet, that diet, this herb, that root. But Ramakrishna's condition was not improving. Yet, there were many who went on saying the doctors are the best doctors in town. They are past masters in their profession. They are doing a wonderful job of treating Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and therefore he would very shortly be on his feet. By this time, Narendranath and a few of other lads of his age group had taken sannyas, monkhood, under Ramakrishna Paramahansa. So, a brother monk of Narendra asked him, what is your take on the treatment of Ramakrishna Paramahansa? The scientist that Vivekananda was, he could not mix hopes with fact. So his answer was very direct. He said, I think they are simply throwing stones in the dark. Indeed, in fact, that was what was happening. We now go to USA and meet a lady called Christina Greenstidel. She went on to take sannyas under Vivekananda and become a nun by the name of Sister Christine. She spent several years in India. She was mightily impressed by Vivekananda's extraordinary mind. This is what she writes, and I quote, that amazing mind, what can one say that will give even a faint idea of its majesty, its glory, its splendor? It was a mind so far transcending other minds, even of those who rank as geniuses, that it seemed different in its very nature. It was a mind like no other. But this was about his mind in general. We are here interested in reasoning, his intellect. Now I recall a certain incident that happened when Vivekananda was delivering a talk somewhere. A lady got up and shouted, Swami, if God had intended that man should smoke, then he would have built a chimney through his head. And Vivekananda's instant repartee was, but he has given us the brains to invent the pipe. Isn't it a scientific and a rationally correct answer, out and out, 100%? Vivekananda then makes it firm, very firm. This is what he says, and I quote, seek not, touch not with your toes even anything that is uncanny. Uncanny means mysterious, strange, bewildering, unusual. That is why not quite believable. He says, do not touch with your toes even anything such. Now it is 1893 and we find Vivekananda on board a ship which is going from Tokyo to the west coast of America. He has an interesting companion on board. Who is he? An Indian industrialist. And enthused by Vivekananda, he goes on describing his plans, his ambitions of building a factory, a plant, even a scientific research institute in India. And Vivekananda generally says, good luck and Godspeed to you. Much later, that industrialist list recorded a certain statement of Vivekananda. And I quote, how wonderful it would be if we could combine the scientific and technological achievements of the West with the asceticism and humanism of India. An intriguing statement. Absolutely. Why does he say so? What does it mean? Let's be careful. I think it means two things. Number one, if you put scientific power, technological power, brutal power in the hands of those who do not have self-control, in fact those who are led by greed and the urge towards self-aggrandizement and power over others, well then collectively they will push mankind to the brink of disaster. I think today something of that kind has begun to happen. It's a moment where one should stop and ponder and take note of this. The other thing that could be is that a scientist is basically one who wants to know things. He wants to learn. He is after knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So he should not be one who thinks of himself. The I concept, the ego, would be very minimal in him. And if at all he wants to apply science, he would want to do it for the sake of the benefit of the world. Your benefit, not my benefit. Is it possible at all to combine such scientific achievements with the asceticism of India, its humanism? Well, if there were a question at some point in time, there is none today, because we have at least one monk of the Ramakrishna order who is a brilliant mathematician. He has solved a particularly difficult mathematical problem that was exercising the brains of the best mathematicians over decades, if not centuries. Question remains, who was that industrialist on board the ship? Well, he was none other than Sir Jamshedji Tata. Today we have his Tata Iron and Steel plant in Jamshedpur and also the Indian Institute of Science that he helped set up. In fact, he had offered its directorship to Swami Vivekananda, who had to decline it because he was busy, very busy otherwise. What does Vivekananda have to say on spirituality? Because that is where Vivekananda belonged particularly. And in the Indian context, spirituality would mean the Vedas, in particular the Upanishads, plus the Bhagavad Gita. And the darshanas, the philosophies or the spiritual world views built on the basis of those. Let us listen to Vivekananda. Number one, a man must not only have faith but intellectual faith also. How many have said this? We have been hearing of faith versus reason. It's either faith or reason. There is no meeting ground. And we have also been hearing of blind faith. Now, if faith is bad enough, why blind faith also? Anyway, these are things we have heard. But have we heard of intellectual faith? Not very often. What does it mean? Well, before that, Vivekananda also says, I take that much of the Vedas as agrees with reason. So he screens, he filters the Vedas. Indeed, the Vedas, or particularly the Upanishads, which are the philosophical parts of the Vedas, the ultimate truths, there are many, but it is said only 10 are the chief Upanishads. And only, I think, 20% of each is good enough as a basis for everything, following therefrom. So what agrees with reason? If it is 20% of 10 Upanishads, that is a very good foundation. Now, intellectual faith issue is of paramount importance today because what is missing is that? Why are millions turning away from religion? At least the scriptures, after reading a bit of it, nibbling at it, they throw it away, saying that these are all gobbledygook. But is it so? Vivekananda says you have to try and filter it through reasoning. What is intellectual faith? So that is the issue. Before that, when we filter the scriptures through the sieve of reasoning, it is not as if we must either accept it, we must say yes to it, or say no to it, we reject it. There is a halfway house which is called agnosticism. As to the existence of God, most are agnostics. Similarly, with passages of the scriptures, there should be many who would be agnostics. Even that is half as good as actually accepting scriptural passages. We now turn to a certain stage in a law of nature, represented, let us say, by physics law, a new law. It starts as a hypothesis. A certain team conducts some experiments and comes out with a theoretical model of what is what. Others apply their reasoning on that. And as more and more of them say, yes, it does seem that the experiments were properly conducted and the inferences drawn are reasonable, and then they strike out on their own to replicate those experiments and see what the results are. If the results go on tallying with the initial hypothesis and proposed law, then the hypothesis becomes a law. So hypothesis is the intellectual faith which propels a man into practice on his own. Absolutely similar is the situation with scriptures. If we accept even a bit of the scripture, some part of the scriptures as agrees with reason, that is like a hypothesis. And since it agrees with us, it should propel us towards practice or sadhana. We turn to this concept of Shabda Praman in the Indian spiritual worldviews or philosophies. Praman means tools of knowledge or means of obtaining valid knowledge. There are several means, like for instance, just seeing or perceiving. It's called direct or pratyaksha, praman. Then there is inference, anuman. Then there is analogy. It's like something that I know. Analogy, upaman. Similarly, there is shabda praman. What is it? It is the testimony of those on whom we can rely. In the case of the scriptures, in India, they were the rishis, whose inner experiences, transcendental experiences, closer to ultimate truth, were recorded in the Upanishads. Is that possible? Let us take an example. We want to go to Shimla on a holiday, but we know nothing of how to get there, which train or plane to take, when does it depart from my city, which lodgings to put up in, etc. We consult makemytrip.com or let us say travelguru.com. We follow it, and using it, we book our tickets, journey to Shimla and back. We booked a local transport and we book lodgings there. And 10 days later, we come back having completed a very successful holiday in Shimla. Now, we did not know who are the men behind makemytrip.com. We never learned it, and we do not propose to get behind it to see who are they who are running makemytrip.com. And yet, I repose faith on these unknown entities. Why? Because others have said it is reliable. And I do that, and it turns out to be successful, effective. That is a great example of intellectual faith in a certain hypothesis that MakeMyTrip.com is presenting. So it has to be followed eventually by actual sadhana practice, and the final personal experiences is what that matters. I would like to make one point here. Even if we do not agree with certain portions of the scriptures, or even 99% of it, but as we saw, religion is theory plus practice. If we practice, if our self-conduct is great spiritually, then does it matter whether we agree with the scriptures, texts or not? There are millions who do not agree with the texts or have never read them and do not propose to read them. Yet their self-conduct is 90% of what the scriptures advise. And there are millions who have actually marked them up. So they can reel off passage after passage, hundreds of them, off the cuff. But their self-conduct leaves much to be wanted. Therefore, let us not jump to conclusions if a person says, I do not buy the scriptures. One other point Vivekananda makes. Just as the law of gravitation existed before its discovery and would exist if all humanity forgot it, so it is with the laws that govern the spiritual world. An equation. He continues, the moral, ethical, and spiritual relations between soul and between individual spirits and the Father of all spirits were there before their discovery and would remain even if we forgot them. They are eternal. In India, the word was Shashvata or Sanatan. Human beings don't create the laws, they discover them. As in conventional science, so also in transcendental science or knowledge, ultimate truth. The rishis discovered the laws, but then they practiced the sadhanas and reached those same truths on their own. In conventional science, a certain discovery by a certain team serves the purpose of all. I do not have to conduct experiments conducted in Cambridge University or Oxford by the pioneers of certain laws of science. Today I can have the benefit of the results of those laws. I can enjoy the fruits of scientific laws discovered by someone unknown to me, X. But in spiritual laws, we have to on our own negotiate the path to ultimate truth. It will not suffice that you have experienced ultimate truth. That will be of no benefit to me. Another issue, Newton was a Britisher. Is his law of gravitation therefore a British law? No, not at all. Einstein's laws of relativity, are they German or Jewish laws? An emphatic no. The laws represented in the Upanishads discovered by the rishis, are they Indian because the rishis were Indians? An emphatic no. Let's invite Einstein. Somehow, anything having to do with science is not complete without inviting him. And he starts off with a wonderful statement. We will have to think of how many could have given us this statement. And I quote, the cosmic religious feeling is the strongest and noblest motive for scientific research. Let's hark back to Vivekananda's statement of scientific and technological achievements combined with India's asceticism. So the motive is not greed nor self-interest. It is a cosmic religious feeling. The mysterious is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. It kindles art and science as well. So religion, art, science seem to have the same origin. What does Vivekananda say? he says the same thing. Art, science, and religion are but three different ways of expressing a single truth. Expressing a single truth. How? Well, what is objectively outside, we never know. So says Indian darshanas. Transcendental knowledge gives you this wisdom that knowledge gathered routinely is not an objectively standalone truth. It depends very much on my stage of spiritual development. As I evolve spiritually, the outer objective world becomes different. Therefore, it is not as if there is only one outer world. That is why art, science, and religion are ways of expressing a single truth. So, our reaction to the world outside is our truth, and that is what matters. And the reaction can be in artistic ways, say literature, poetry, painting, music, or through knowledge, through physics and chemistry, or psychology even, or through religious devotion to divinity. All these are correct. All these are right. Then he adds, the world is neither true nor untrue. It is the shadow of truth. Again, let us try to understand it on our own from first principles. That is how we see whether a certain statement is rational or not. Now, how do we gain knowledge? We gain knowledge through our senses, maybe sometimes assisted by instruments like microscope, plus our mind, plus our intellect. Now, these constitute the apparatus of perceiving or knowing. Knowing happens in me. After I know, we can dispose of the apparatus. The knowing remains. So it is not as if the knowledge had lodged in the apparatus. It was a conduit. And it was processing signals. It was not like a pipe empty. Every moment through these stages, signals were being processed in one way or another. Therefore, says Indian Darshana, the knowledge you gain is paroksha, indirect, mediate through an intermediary. So what should you do? The real knowledge will come when you discard this mechanism. Then what? Because I want to know what is out there and I am here. So when I am with that, just that and me and nothing intervening, that is when realization dawns in me in deepest concentration, meditation. That is the real truth, and that is immediate. There is no intermediary. It is a paroksha knowledge. But paroksha knowledge is some kind of an expression of the real, transcendental, aparoksha knowledge. Therefore, it cannot be dismissed totally. So it is like the shadow of a bird. If we go on chasing the shadow, one day we might look up and find the bird. So this is how it is. And what is that aparoksha knowledge? Well, since that is gained, happens, even the word gained is not correct, it happens without the assistance of that apparatus of senses, mind, intellect. How that is cannot be described, because all description will inevitably have to involve that apparatus. And that is why it cannot be expressed, described, or found out through reasoning, because reasoning also depends on that apparatus. I may say an apple is like a pear. Now, if I have not seen a pear, I wouldn't know how to describe an apple. And unless there are multiple of things, logic wouldn't even evolve. With one single thing, there is no logic, no description, no why, no what, no how. And it is precisely there that transcendental knowledge belongs. Therefore, even reasoning has to be set aside when we are into the realm of transcendental experiences. Now Vivekananda becomes bold. Boldness was one of his most prominent features. Are the same methods of investigation which we apply to the science and knowledge outside to be applied to the science of religion? How many religionists have the courage to ask this question? Wouldn't one get scared asking it? But Vivekananda asks this question, and boldly, and then he becomes bolder in providing the answer. This must be so. No ifs and buts. But here, again, let us pause and let us not think that the moment we apply this procedure to spirituality claims, most of it will be demolished. Again, we will have to guard against the possibility of one extreme, which is cynicism. Oh, has it been checked through a microscope? No. So, abandon it. This is cynical disregard. No, that will certainly not do. It is not a scientific thing to do, to have that attitude. It is non-scientific. It is unreasonable to have that attitude. The other is to gullibly swallow everything hook, line and sinker. Even that will not do. So the proper scientific attitude is somewhere between the two. Anyway, then Vivekananda says, after we do that, all that is dross will be taken off from religion, he says. But the essential parts of religion will emerge triumphant. Let us remember that Vivekananda was a past master in meditation. He was born with that power. In fact, when he was just a child, maybe 6, 7 years old, he and a few of his friends were meditating in a garden or somewhere. And hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes came and started biting them. They were bare-bodied. His friends couldn't stand them more than half a minute, so they stood up, went away. And they were surprised to see that Narendra kept at it, kept meditating for a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour. He couldn't even feel the bites of the mosquitoes. That was his concentration. Ramakrishna Paramahansa described him as Dhyan Siddha, adept in meditation from birth. Vivekananda himself later said, one day he concentrated very hard, harder and harder on a spot on a wall, and suddenly had the experience of transcendental truth. How many can do that? And he says that the essential parts of religion will emerge triumphant. Let us await that day. Then he says, if you put religion through the scientific test, then what will happen? Then religion will have greater strength, while it will lose out on many passages having to be sidelined. But it will have greater strength because physics or chemistry has no internal mandate to vouch for its truth, which religion has. If we go to a religionist and tell him, well, passage A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, out of that A, B appeal to me. I find them reasonable, acceptable. C, D do not. K, L do not. G makes no sense to me. But F does. He will turn to me and say, who are you to question the texts? You have to accept all of them. If you pick and choose, if that is what you propose to do, this is not the place. Don't come to me. Now you go to a chemist. He is mixing a liquid A with liquid B. and he expects the outcome to be liquid X. Liquid A and B he is mixing and expects liquid X out of it. You ask him, what if liquid Y results and not X? He said, I'll be fine with that. I expect X, but it may or may not happen. If it does not, if Y happens, I'll be happy to accept that. Why can he say so? Because he has no internal mandate to vouch for the truth of X. He takes that to be true as nature tells him it is through the best procedures that he knows of. He is not stuck in a certain model. But many religionists, unfortunately, are. The time is ripe when, therefore, many are beginning to question great portions of religious texts. That is, again, not to say that they are rejecting it. They are turning agnostic. Again, Vivekananda says, in our country, we go down on our knees before the man who reads the Vedas. And we do not care for the man who's studying physics. This is superstition. It is not Vedanta at all. Why does he say so? Because, as we saw, conventional means of senses, mind, intellect give us the shadow of truth. That is physics also. Physics also similarly gives us the shadow of truth, maybe through even keener observation. Yet it remains the shadow. But in chasing the shadow one day, physicists and us, all of us, will look up and find the real bird. In fact, today, in the world of physics, in particular, in the world of quantum mechanics, this is beginning to happen. To more and more physicists, it is seeming that what we perceive outside is actually half our creation. As Vivekananda says, the external world is the internal world writ large. Physicists today are half agreeing with this. Now, while physics, chemistry are trying to understand the world outside, psychology, a science, through the very same procedure, experiment, observation, inference, and the senses, implements mind, intellect, are trying to understand what is within us physically, chemically, electromagnetically. And they are delving deeper and deeper. This is the science of psychology. And psychology is making today extraordinary discoveries which even a poet might not have imagined. Therefore, Vivekananda had said that the real science is psychology. He called it the science of sciences. When psychology matures and moves further out, deeper, then a new world of science will be accepted more and more by scientists. Vivekananda brings us face to face with the problems one has with religion. Religions are encumbered with such a mass of explanation which come from outside. One angel is in charge of the sun, another of the moon, and so on ad infinitum. Well, we will agree with this. That is how it is. Devas, Devis, gods, goddesses, angels. But what about science? Now, Vivekananda makes a fantastic statement. I wonder if any scientist, even the best in the world, could have made this statement on what science essentially is, how it differs from other things. He says this, and I quote, "Science means that the cause of a thing is sought out by the nature of the thing itself." The moment somebody asks us for the cause of something X, we point to Y. If there is no Y, we invent a Y. In religion, why is this happening, that happening? Because of devas, devis, gods, goddesses, and all that. External to the things which are the subject matter. Science, says Vivekananda, supposing the issue is why is X the way it is, scientific answer is because that is the nature of X. when Newton found one particle moving towards the other, moving towards each other, two particles A and B moving towards each other, he did not give the answer by positing a third something C. He didn't say because of C. His answer, the law of gravitation, the first sentence of it is every particle of matter attracts every other particle of matter. That is the nature of particles of matter. Now, this is a scientific solution. Science does not go beyond this. It does not say why it is so. It merely says how this movement happens. It cannot even say what a particle is and what is attraction. He sees them. He starts off from a particle and attraction and then says, well, that is how it is. And he gives a mathematical formula for that. That is where his brilliance was. But he does not induct anything extraneous. Vivekananda then cites Advaita Vedanta, which is monism. There is only one thing, Brahman, non-dualism. Therefore, there is nothing external to it. So, all explanations of Advaita Vedanta come from within the model, the paradigm of Advaita. Therefore, it is the most scientific religion. He says, there is no extra cosmic God, no outside genius. It is self-creating, self-dissolving, self-manifesting, one infinite existence, the Brahman. Again, Vivekananda reminds us of the bewildering phenomena that is the universe. To get any reason out of this mass of incongruity we call human life, we have to transcend our reason. He who was promoting reason all the way now talks of transcending reason. Why? Because a stage will come when this apparatus of the senses, mind, intellect will be found to be deficient. Even physicists will find it to be deficient, and this is beginning to happen. When that happens, then they will have to transcend that apparatus. When the apparatus has to be transcended, reason also has to be. Because reason is born out of facts, apparent facts delivered to us by this apparatus. When the apparatus is found insufficient, then the so-called facts delivered to us by this apparatus will also have to be found deficient. That being so, we'll have to transcend reason. Then he says we must do it scientifically. Slowly by regular practice. What does it mean? It means yoga. In India, yoga means the soul, the individual soul, joining, yoking, combining with the oversoul, the Paramatma, the Atma and Paramatma, joining, merging. Regular practice. Now, meditation is the most direct way. When we give up the apparatus of senses and all, what we are left with is the world and me, and nothing intervening. Therefore, meditating within me is the obvious and the most direct, immediate thing that comes to mind. But yoga happens through other means also, strangely and happily. How? Through selfless service. A life led selflessly for the sake of others gives us the same truth that meditation can. Similarly, devotion to divinity and also knowledge. It is said that in the modern day, gaining that keen kind of knowledge is not possible. But still, that is one of the ways. So, he said, it has to be done scientifically, slowly, by regular practice. All these yogas need regular practice, careful practice. And one point here, reason, which holds such a high place in the modern day world, let us see what is its limitation. I have found that non-scientists swear more by reason than scientists sometimes. Reason is like light. Supposing we are in a dark room, gloomy, we can faintly see some people doing something, some furniture, TV, radio, whatever. But it's not clear. Then somebody switches a light on and everything becomes clear. That is reason. But reason did not create the tables, chairs, or the human beings or the activities. It does not create anything. If Newton says two particles attract each other in this particular way, reason only makes a statement of fact. It does not say why that is the way they should have behaved. So, reason goes that far only to know what that thing called particle is or why they behave in that. We have to transcend this apparatus of science and go beyond. That is where all the answers to all the remaining problems will be found. Therefore, Vivekananda says the greatest thing is meditation, and adds something that is most important to the modern day citizen of the world. We should listen to it very carefully, let it get embedded in our hearts. Religion as a science, as a study, is the greatest and healthiest exercise that the human mind can have. Most unhappily, tragically, today, the modern day citizen of the world, including the youngsters, it is religion that they push away. The first thing they push away is religion. That is not good at all. Anyway, how then will men turn to religion? Well, it seems when science says it's worth trying it out, it seems that indeed certain essential parts of religion are the truth that even science is missing, but science is pointing to those. So we better enter into practice of religion carefully, scientifically, slowly, by regular practice, as Vivekananda says. And Vivekananda strikes a very optimistic note, and we will end with that note. He says, science and religion will meet and shake hands. Let's hope that day comes sooner rather than later. So, cheers to you. Take care. Stay safe. Namaskar.